August 22nd, 1992. A hot summer night in Macon, Georgia. 17-year-old Jessica Monroe finished her shift at a small grocery store and started walking home. It was less than a mile, a route she had taken many times before. She never arrived. The next morning, her family expected to hear her come downstairs for breakfast. Instead, they found her bed empty. Hours later, searchers discovered her purse tossed into a drainage ditch along the road. Inside were her wallet, lipstick, and work ID badge. 30 feet away lay one of her sneakers. There was no sign of Jessica. Police treated it as an abduction from the start. Dogs tracked her scent to the wooded edge of the street, then lost it. Helicopters scanned the riverbanks. Volunteers combed through fields, creeks, and abandoned lots. Hundreds of people joined, but the search ended with nothing. Rumors spread quickly through Macon. Neighbors whispered about a red pickup truck seen circling near the store that night. A truck driver later told investigators he saw a man talking to a teenage girl near the parking lot close to 9:30. Witnesses placed a neighbor, already known for harassment, near the same area. Jessica's boyfriend became another focus after reports of an argument a week earlier. Evidence was collected: cigarette butts, tire tracks pressed into the dirt, strands of hair tangled in weeds near the ditch. But in 1992, DNA technology was still limited. The samples went into storage too small to build a full profile. By 1994, there was still no arrest. The Monroe family refused to give up. They stood in front of cameras holding photos of Jessica, begging for answers. Yellow ribbons appeared on trees across the city. Each August, the community lit candles and prayed for her safe return. But the case grew colder with each passing year. This was the beginning of a mystery that would last nearly 3 decades. A disappearance that haunted a town, divided neighbors, and kept a family trapped in uncertainty. Stay with this story as we follow the investigation, the suspects, and the evidence that would one day lead to a shocking breakthrough. And before we continue, tell me in the comments, who do you think? A Saturday night in Macon, Georgia. The summer heat was still heavy in the air. The kind of night when families sat on porches and kids rode bikes until dark. At the corner of Pine Street, Jessica Monroe finished her shift at the small grocery store where she worked part-time. She was 17 years old, a senior in high school, and she had been saving money for college. It was just after 9:15 when she clocked out. She wore her work shirt and carried her purse. Her routine was simple. She walked home less than a mile, following the same streets she always used. It was supposed to be safe. A quick walk through a residential neighborhood where she was known. But that night, Jessica never made it back. The next morning, her family expected to hear her footsteps on the stairs, the sound of the refrigerator opening as she reached for breakfast. Instead, her bed was still neatly made. She hadn't come home. Hours passed and panic set in. Linda Monroe, Jessica's mother, started calling friends, neighbors, anyone who might know where she was. Nobody had seen her. By noon, police were contacted and a missing person report was filed. Within hours, searchers were combing the route between the store and the Monroe home. That was when the first discovery changed everything. Jessica's purse was found tossed into a drainage ditch along the road she normally took. Inside were her wallet, lipstick, and her grocery store ID badge. None of it had been stolen. The items were left behind as if dropped during a struggle. Not far from the purse, about 30 feet away, searchers found another clue: a sneaker lying in the grass at the edge of the road. It was Jessica's. The placement suggested she had been forced off her path, pulled toward the wooded line where the pavement ended. Police treated it as an abduction immediately. Officers taped off the ditch and the roadside. They collected cigarette butts, measured tire tracks pressed into the dirt, and bagged strands of hair that appeared tangled in the weeds. Neighbors living near the intersection were interviewed late into the night. Some said they heard a car engine around 9:30. One recalled seeing a pickup truck drive past twice. Another remembered a shout but couldn't say. By the second day, the story was everywhere. Flyers were taped to storefronts and gas stations. Yellow ribbons appeared on telephone poles. Local businesses donated water and food to support the volunteers. Television crews arrived, and by Monday, Jessica's face was broadcast across Georgia. The headline on the front page of the Macon Telegraph read, "Teen vanishes on way home from work." The police department held a press briefing. They confirmed evidence had been collected but refused to release details. Reporters pressed for answers, but detectives kept their statements tight. They admitted the case was being treated as a likely abduction. Behind the cameras, the Monroe family faced their own nightmare. Linda Monroe stood before reporters holding her daughter's school photo, insisting Jessica would never run away. She spoke of her daughter's college plans, her dedication to school, and her steady job. Her words echoed across television sets. She would never disappear by choice. As days turned into weeks, the search scaled back. Volunteers returned to work, school, and family routines. But the Monroes pressed on. They drove through back roads, checked fields themselves, taped new flyers when the old ones weathered. August turned to September with no trace of Jessica beyond what had already been found. By the end of the week of her disappearance, police made their position clear. They confirmed Jessica was being treated as an abducted person. They ruled out the possibility of her leaving voluntarily. Investigators said they believed someone forced her off her path that night. Still, no arrest followed. Leads dried up, tips went nowhere, and witnesses couldn't provide enough detail. The impact on the community was immediate. Parents warned their daughters never to walk alone, even during daylight. Teenagers who once cut through back paths and wooded trails now avoided them. Every unfamiliar vehicle was noticed. Every stranger drew suspicion. The case hung over Macon like a shadow. Each night, the local news repeated the same story, showing Jessica's photograph alongside the words, "Missing Teenager." Candlelight vigils were held, with neighbors holding hands praying she would come home. Her friends tied yellow ribbons around trees near the school, symbols of hope that grew more desperate with each passing month. But despite the relentless efforts, Jessica's fate remained a mystery. The purse in the ditch, the shoe in the grass, the silence that followed, all of it painted a picture of sudden disappearance with no clear answers. This was not just another missing person. It was the beginning of a case that would haunt Macon for nearly 30 years. A disappearance that would shift from active search to cold case, then finally to shocking resolution decades later. For now, the Monroe family waited in fear. The community whispered in uncertainty, and the investigation pressed forward with little more than scattered clues. Jessica Monroe had vanished on her way home, and the question that hung in the air was simple but devastating. Who took her, and why? In the first days after Jessica Monroe vanished, the search was all anyone in Macon could talk about. The flyers, the volunteers, the helicopters. It felt like the city had united with one goal. Police brought Ryan in for questioning. He said he had nothing to do with it. He claimed he was home on the night of August 22nd, watching television with two friends. At first his friends backed him up, but detectives noticed inconsistencies. The timeline was off by nearly half an hour in one version of the story. One friend said Ryan called him later than Ryan admitted. Another seemed unsure of the exact time he arrived at Ryan's house. These small cracks were enough to keep investigators suspicious. They pressed him for details, but Ryan didn't break. He maintained that he spent the night at home. Without hard evidence, suspicion alone couldn't carry the case. Officers searched his car and his room. They found nothing linking him to Jessica's purse, the sneaker, or the ditch. No blood, no fibers, no fingerprints. The arguments looked bad, but arguments weren't proof of abduction. After repeated interrogations, Ryan was eventually released, though many in town still whispered his name. The next person on the list was a neighbor, Carl Jennings. He lived just a few houses away from the Monroe family. Jennings was 32, unemployed at the time, and already known to police. He had a record of harassment complaints and trespassing charges. Women in the neighborhood described him as odd, sometimes too friendly, other times aggressive. He had a reputation for loitering near the wooded trail where Jessica's scent was last tracked. A witness came forward claiming they saw Jennings' car near that very area on the night Jessica disappeared. The time was around 9:30, just 15 minutes after she left the store. Investigators brought Jennings in. He denied everything. He said he had been asleep at home and had no idea what happened to Jessica. Detectives searched his vehicle and combed through his small house. They found nothing suspicious. No clothing fibers, no blood, no signs Jessica had ever been there. He wasn't cleared, but without evidence, they couldn't hold him. Then came what many believed was the most promising lead of all, the red pickup truck. A truck driver passing through Macon reported seeing a teenage girl talking with a man beside a red pickup in the grocery store parking lot. The sighting was close to 9:30. Just when physical evidence collected at the scene also failed to give investigators the breakthrough they needed. Cigarette butts were bagged and sent to the state crime lab, but in 1992, DNA testing wasn't advanced enough to extract profiles from them. Tire tracks were photographed and cast, but as investigators quickly learned, they were generic. Pickup tires that could belong to countless vehicles. Strands of hair recovered near the purse were examined under a microscope, but again, technology limited what could be done. No full comparison. No definitive match. Community interviews added more fragments, but no clarity. Some neighbors claimed they saw headlights near the woods that night. Others recalled hearing what sounded like a girl's scream around the same time. But the details were inconsistent. Times didn't line up. The descriptions conflicted. Memory faded quickly, and without hard evidence, none of these reports could be used to move the case forward. As weeks turned into months, the investigation shifted from urgent to frustrating. Every lead seemed to dry up. Ryan Brooks was still watched closely. Jennings remained under suspicion in whispers, and the red pickup was never found. But there was no physical link tying any of them to Jessica's disappearance. Meanwhile, media coverage only increased the pressure. Local newspapers ran stories with Jessica's school photo on the front page. Television segments speculated on the boyfriend, the neighbor, the mysterious truck. Each article fueled more rumors in the community. Parents demanded answers. Neighbors pointed fingers. And every time police held a press conference, they had little new to share. By late 1993, the momentum was gone. Detectives followed up on tips from nearby counties, checking similar missing person cases to see if there was a connection. None matched. Jessica's case stood alone. With no usable DNA, no eyewitness strong enough for court, and no confession, the investigation stalled. The Monroe family grew more desperate. Linda Monroe continued speaking to the press, insisting her daughter's case not be forgotten. She appeared at city council meetings, demanding more resources. She called state officials and begged them not to let the investigation fade. The investigation into Jessica's disappearance ended not with resolution, but with silence. A young woman vanished, suspects were questioned, evidence was gathered, and still nothing led to an arrest. The red pickup, the boyfriend's shaky alibi, the neighbor's suspicious past. Each trail seemed promising, but all dissolved into uncertainty. What remained was a family waiting, a community uneasy, and a case that would sit dormant for years. It would take new science, decades later, to answer the questions that investigators in 1992 could not. The Monroe family was shattered in the weeks that followed Jessica's disappearance. Her mother, Linda, became the face of the family's search. She stood in front of cameras, holding her daughter's school photo, repeating the same line. She would never disappear by choice. Her words became a plea that echoed across Georgia. Inside the house, Jessica's bedroom was left untouched. Posters on the wall, books stacked on her desk, clothes folded in the dresser. The family refused to change anything. It was as if they believed she might walk back through the door at any moment. The community rallied in those early months. Vigils were held in downtown Macon. Crowds gathered with candles, standing shoulder to shoulder, calling Jessica's name into the night. Yellow ribbons appeared everywhere, tied to trees, mailboxes, storefronts. They were a silent promise that Jessica had not been forgotten. Every August, on the anniversary of her disappearance, people returned to light candles again. The ritual became part of Macon's calendar, a yearly reminder of a teenager who never came home. Behind the scenes, the Monroe family stayed in constant contact with police. They called detectives weekly, pushing for updates. Most of the time, the answer was the same. There were no new leads. Meetings with investigators ended in frustration. Evidence had been collected, but it produced nothing. The purse, the sneaker, the cigarette butts, the tire tracks. All of it sat in storage while the family waited for news that never came. Life inside the Monroe home was marked by fear. The atmosphere around town grew heavy with rumors. Whispers spread about suspects. Some pointed to Ryan Brooks, the boyfriend, remembering their argument at the football game. Others blamed the neighbor, Carl Jennings, who already carried a bad reputation. And for many, suspicion fell on an unknown predator lurking in the shadows. Every time a red pickup drove through Macon, people noticed. Some stared, some whispered. In a small city, everyone looked for answers, but no one had them. The media added to the pressure. Local television continued to air updates, showing Jessica's picture beside the words "missing teen." Each broadcast repeated the timeline, but never offered new answers. For the first year, national outlets also covered the case. But as time passed, their interest faded. Headlines shrank. Coverage dwindled. The family felt abandoned, left to fight on their own. Sensational stories in the press only fueled gossip, not progress. The strain on the Monroes grew worse with each year. Linda pushed forward, attending vigils, speaking to reporters, calling investigators. She became the public face of the case, often exhausted but relentless. Her husband withdrew, rarely appearing in front of cameras. The pressure of constant attention, the weight of unanswered questions tore at the family's private life. Relationships strained under the burden of waiting for answers that never came. Still, the community held on to remembrance. Each August, neighbors and friends organized events in Jessica's honor. They called them Jessica's Night, where people would gather with candles and prayers. At school, classmates created banners and tributes, writing her name in yearbooks so she would not be forgotten. Churches across Macon included her in Sunday prayers, keeping her story alive even as leads disappeared. By the mid-1990s, the case was still unsolved, but the community refused to let it fade entirely. Vigils continued in 1995 and 1996, though the crowds grew smaller and fewer reporters showed up. The early urgency had slowed. The television cameras no longer stayed for long. The story was old to outsiders. But for the Monroe family, it was never old. For them, every day was the same. It was April 1999, almost 7 years after Jessica Monroe walked out of her job at a grocery store and never came home. The case had grown quiet. Vigils continued, the family still pushed for answers, but the investigation was cold. Then, by chance, a discovery was made along the Ocmulgee River that would change everything. A local fisherman spotted a tarp snagged on the roots of a tree near the water's edge, about 10 miles from Jessica's neighborhood. At first, it looked like debris carried downstream, the kind of thing that often washed up after spring rains. But when he moved closer, he realized the tarp contained bones. Authorities were called immediately. Within hours, sheriff's deputies and forensic teams arrived and sealed off the riverbank. The scene was handled with care. Investigators worked along the muddy shoreline, collecting every piece of evidence they could. Inside the tarp were skeletal remains, along with fragments of clothing and small personal items. The condition of the bones suggested they had been underwater for years, only resurfacing when the river shifted. Some items were degraded, but enough remained to tell a story. Dental records were brought in to make the identification. Within days, officials confirmed the remains belonged to Jessica Monroe. Alongside the bones was a torn denim blouse, similar to what she had been last seen wearing. Jewelry was also recovered, pieces her family recognized immediately. After nearly 7 years of waiting, the Monroe family received the call they had dreaded. Jessica was no longer missing. She was gone. The cause of death was difficult to determine after so much time. Forensic pathologists examined the bones closely. There was evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, strong enough to suggest violence. There were no signs of drowning or natural causes. The conclusion was clear enough to investigators. Jessica's death was the result of foul play. But beyond that, the trail ended. The discovery sent shockwaves through Macon. For years, the community had held out hope, however faint, that Jessica might be alive somewhere. That she might have been taken but could one day come back. That hope collapsed with the news from the river. Law enforcement made their position clear. Jessica's case was no longer a missing person investigation. It was now a homicide. Investigators told the public they strongly suspected foul play, but admitted they had no prime suspect. The remains provided confirmation of death, but little in the way of new evidence. The tarp, the bones, and the items recovered were preserved carefully for the possibility of future testing. Even in 1999, technology was improving, but not enough to unlock the answers hidden in the evidence. The media returned to the story briefly. Local newspapers ran front-page headlines. Jessica Monroe's remains found after 7 years. Regional TV stations covered the funeral and the investigation's new direction. National media, which had long since moved on, picked it up again for a moment, framing it as both tragic and unresolved. For the Monroe family, the attention meant little. What mattered was that Jessica's life had ended violently, and they still had no idea who was responsible. Despite the recovery of her remains, the investigation stalled once again. Detectives revisited the original files from 1992 through 1994. They went back over statements from Ryan Brooks, the boyfriend. They reviewed the alibis of Carl Jennings, the neighbor. They searched records on red pickup trucks registered in the county during that time. Nothing new connected. Leads remained as thin as they had been in the early 1990s. The discovery provided clarity on Jessica's fate, but not on the person who caused it. Without DNA matches or living witnesses, the case could not move forward. Detectives admitted privately that they were frustrated. The Monroe family, after 7 years of waiting, was once again left with grief and no answers. By the end of 1999, Jessica Monroe's disappearance was no longer a mystery of where she was. It was now the unsolved homicide of a teenager whose life had been cut short. The community carried a new kind of sorrow. The yellow ribbons, once symbols of hope, now marked remembrance. The vigils continued, but they had changed. They were no longer about bringing Jessica home. They were about demanding justice for a crime that remained in the dark. The physical evidence collected in 1992 and recovered again in 1999 remained in storage. Cigarette butts, strands of hair, and Jessica's fingernail scrapings were retested in the early 2000s. By then, DNA testing had improved, and investigators hoped technology might deliver a breakthrough. But the samples were too small, too degraded. No match was generated in CODIS, the national database. Once again, the case hit a wall. For the Monroe family, silence from investigators was unbearable. Linda Monroe refused to let her daughter's case disappear into forgotten files. She wrote letters to governors, senators, and state officials, urging them to provide more funding for cold case investigations. She became an advocate, traveling to crime victim conferences and speaking publicly about Jessica's case. She reminded anyone who would listen that a teenager had been taken, and justice had never been served. The community around Macon also worked to keep Jessica's memory alive. Friends and neighbors organized annual events called Jessica's Walk, gathering people to march through downtown streets as a reminder that her case was unsolved. Local churches held prayer services, and every August, vigils continued. But over time, the crowds grew smaller. What had once filled the town square now drew only a few dozen supporters. Media coverage faded as well. Local outlets still ran short pieces on anniversaries, but regional and national media no longer paid attention. Nationally, the 2000s were a time when cold cases were slowly being solved through improved forensic methods. Across Georgia and the Southeast, families were getting long-awaited answers. Cases that had been dormant for decades were cracked by DNA technology that hadn't existed before. But Jessica's case was not among them. Each solved case in another city was a painful reminder that her evidence had not yet spoken. Community perception shifted. Some in Macon believed the case would never be solved. They felt too much time had passed, too many opportunities had been missed. Others insisted a breakthrough would eventually come. They pointed to advances in DNA and the dedication of cold case units. Jessica's name continued to circulate in true crime circles locally, but outside of those small groups, the case rarely surfaced. By the early 2000s, Jessica's disappearance and death were still unsolved. The cold case files sat in storage, evidence preserved but untouched for long stretches. Detectives came and went, each leaving behind the same conclusion: no viable suspect, no prosecutable case. For the Monroe family, hope was fragile, but it was not gone. They believed technology would eventually catch up. They believed the evidence would one day reveal the truth. But as the years dragged on, it became harder to keep faith. More than 2 decades had passed, and the silence around Jessica's case had grown heavy. By the middle of the 2010s, the reality was stark. Jessica Monroe's case was still unsolved. No one had been charged. The man responsible was still free. For Macon, the story had shifted from urgent headlines to distant memory. For the Monroe family, it remained the central fact of their lives. They waited, year after year, for the day the evidence would finally speak. By 2018, Jessica Monroe's case had been cold for more than 2 decades. The investigation had stalled after her remains were found in 1999. DNA technology had advanced, but her evidence always seemed to fall short. Each test ended with the same result: no match, no suspect, no justice. For the Monroe family, hope had become a long, painful waiting game. That year, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation launched a new initiative focused on unsolved homicides. The idea was to apply the emerging tool of genetic genealogy to long-dormant cases. Investigators across the state were told to re-examine their cold files, looking for preserved evidence that could be retested with modern methods. Jessica's case was near the top of the list. Her fingernail scrapings, carefully preserved since 1992, were sent to a specialized lab. It was one of the few remaining biological samples that might still hold answers. Forensic scientists used advanced sequencing techniques far beyond what had been possible in the early 2000s. For the first time, they were able to build a partial genetic profile of the unknown male, whose DNA had been found under Jessica's nails. It wasn't a full match, but it was enough to open a new door. The profile was uploaded to GED Match, an online platform used by genealogists to trace ancestry through shared DNA. The database was already being used successfully in other states to solve cold cases. Within weeks, the results came back. The DNA from Jessica's case matched with distant relatives of a family living in Alabama. That match gave investigators a starting point. Genealogists began building out a family tree, using public records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and obituaries to connect branches across generations. Piece by piece, they narrowed the field. Dozens of relatives were identified, but only a handful would have been the right age and location in 1992. The tree pointed investigators toward one man, Frank Dillard. In 1992, he was 24 years old. He lived in Macon, just 2 miles from the Monroe family's home. He worked as an auto mechanic, a job that gave him knowledge of vehicles and mobility around the area. And there was something else. Dillard owned a red Chevy pickup truck in the early 1990s. The very vehicle that had haunted the investigation since a trucker reported seeing a man and a teenage girl near a red pickup outside the grocery store on the night Jessica disappeared. For years, police had canvassed every red truck they could find. Somehow, Dillard's had never raised enough suspicion to put him on the official list. Former neighbors remembered him as quiet, someone who kept to himself. A colleague from the auto shop later told investigators, "Frank wasn't the type you noticed. He'd work his shift, go home, and you wouldn't think twice about him." That low profile had kept him under the radar, but the genealogy work placed him squarely in focus. His DNA lined up with the family matches from Alabama. His age, location, and ownership of a red pickup all fit the profile. By late 2018, investigators had narrowed their search. Franklin Dillard became the prime suspect in a case that had been unsolved for 26 years. Investigators began digging deeper into his history. They confirmed that Dillard had lived in Macon until the late 1990s. Around 1998, after Jessica's remains were found, he moved to Florida. A few years later, he relocated again, this time settling in Alabama. He had married briefly, divorced, and kept working as a mechanic. His record was clean enough that he had never drawn serious police attention. That absence of a criminal trail explained why he had escaped scrutiny in the 1990s. But now, thanks to genetic genealogy, he was no longer invisible. Detectives knew they needed direct confirmation. A partial profile wasn't enough to prosecute. They needed a full DNA sample from Dillard to prove he was the man Jessica fought against on that August night in 1992. The decision was made to place him under surveillance. Investigators coordinated with local authorities in Alabama to track his movements. They needed to find a way to collect something he had touched or discarded, anything that could provide uncontaminated DNA. The weight of nearly 3 decades hung over the case. For Jessica's family, the breakthrough brought both relief and fear. The cold case that had haunted Macon since 1992 was no longer silent. The red pickup, the DNA under Jessica's nails, the man who had lived just 2 miles away. All of it was coming together. The truth was finally within reach. Stay with this story. In the next part, we'll follow investigators as they close in on Franklin Dillard, the moment they captured his DNA, and the shocking revelation about his role in the search for Jessica back in 1992. Before we move on, let me know in the comments. Do you think police should have looked harder at Dillard back then? Or was it impossible without today's technology? By early 2019, investigators were ready to act on the strongest lead the case had ever produced. The genealogy trail had pointed to Frank Dillard, once a 24-year-old mechanic living only 2 miles from Jessica Monroe's home. On paper, he looked like a quiet neighbor who had drifted away, moving to Florida in the late 1990s and later settling in Alabama. But the DNA under Jessica's fingernails said otherwise. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, working with Alabama alcohol authorities, launched a quiet surveillance operation. Detectives followed Dillard through his daily routines. He worked at a small garage, fixing transmissions and brake lines. He lived alone in a modest house on the edge of town. Investigators noted how predictable his life seemed. He stopped at the same gas station in the mornings. He grabbed lunch at a diner near the garage. He rarely interacted with anyone outside of work. All they needed was something he touched and discarded. A coffee cup, a napkin, a cigarette butt. Anything that could carry his DNA. For weeks they waited, careful not to draw attention. The case had been cold for nearly 3 decades. They couldn't risk tipping him off now. In March 2019, the chance finally came. Dillard pulled into a gas station near his home after work. He bought a soda, drank it on the spot, and tossed the empty can into a trash bin outside. Within minutes, plainclothes officers retrieved it. The can was rushed to the lab. Days later, the results came back. The news spread instantly. After nearly 30 years, the red pickup mystery had been solved. Local headlines captured the moment. Red pickup mystery solved after 27 years. Reporters noted the irony. Dillard had once joined volunteers searching for Jessica in 1992, walking the same woods and handing out flyers. To many in Macon, that revelation felt like betrayal. Neighbors who had lived near the Monroes in the 1990s were shocked. One recalled, "He seemed like a regular guy, always fixing cars, never causing trouble. Nobody thought he could do something like this." Another remembered seeing him among the search groups, saying, "It makes you sick knowing he stood there pretending to help." The Monroe family was notified immediately. For Linda Monroe, the arrest was both a relief and a wound reopened. She told reporters,
We lived alongside the truth all these years and never knew it. Finally, justice has come." Her words carried both gratitude and anger. Gratitude that investigators never gave up. Anger that Dillard had walked free for so long. In Macon, the community struggled with disbelief. Many had grown up remembering the search for Jessica, the vigils, the fear that followed her disappearance. Learning that the man responsible had been right there all along cut deeply. Social media in Georgia lit up with posts about the arrest. Some praised investigators for their persistence. Others asked how he had escaped detection for nearly 3 decades. Once in custody, Dillard was transported back to Georgia. Prosecutors announced that the evidence was clear. Jessica Monroe had fought back against her attacker, leaving his DNA under her fingernails. They emphasized that this wasn't speculation, it was science. The match between Dillard and the evidence was absolute. Dillard was formally charged in Georgia with first-degree murder and kidnapping. He was held without bond. The courtroom hearings that followed were brief but decisive. Prosecutors outlined their case. Defense attorneys requested more time, but the DNA stood as the centerpiece of the prosecution's argument. The arrest reignited public attention nationwide. Television networks revisited the case. True crime programs featured the story of the teenager who vanished in 1992 and how new science finally exposed the suspect. It was held up as an example of how persistence and technology.
As the legal process moved forward, the stage was set for trial. The prosecution prepared to lay out the genealogy evidence, the DNA confirmation, and the timeline linking Dillard to Jessica's disappearance. The defense began shaping its strategy, hinting it would question the reliability of DNA and point to the absence of a confession or eyewitness. But for the people of Macon, the focus was simple. After 27 years of silence, a name had finally been attached to Jessica Monroe's case. Franklin Dillard was in custody. The wait for justice was nearly over. For nearly 3 decades, Jessica's family had lived with nothing but questions. In 2019, they finally had an answer. But the story was not finished. The arrest was only the beginning of the courtroom battle that would decide Dillard's fate. In the next part, we'll step inside the trial. We'll see how prosecutors built their case, how the defense tried to fight back, and how a jury delivered a verdict that changed everything. Before we continue, tell me what you think. Should DNA evidence alone be enough to convict in cases like this, even without a confession or eyewitness testimony? The trial of Frank Dillard began in early 2022 at the Macon County Courthouse. After 30 years of waiting, the case that had haunted Georgia was finally laid out before a jury. The courtroom was packed every day. Reporters filled the benches, cameras lined the steps outside, and members of the public stood in line hoping to witness history. For the Monroe family, it was the first time they would hear the full weight of the evidence presented in open court. The prosecution wasted no time in outlining their case. Their strategy was clear from the start. DNA was the cornerstone. They reminded the jury that under Jessica Monroe's fingernails was a genetic profile that had gone unidentified for decades. In 2019, it had been matched with Franklin Dillard. That, they argued, was the voice of Jessica herself, preserved in evidence, speaking across time. Prosecutors described the genealogy process in plain terms. Experts walked the jury through how a partial DNA profile, uploaded to GED Match, had. The timeline was just as important. Prosecutors reminded jurors that in 1992, Dillard was 24, living only 2 miles from Jessica's home and working as a mechanic. He owned a red Chevy pickup, the same type of truck a witness had reported seeing near Jessica the night she disappeared. They showed how he moved away shortly after Jessica's remains were discovered in 1999, first to Florida and later to Alabama,
His moves, they argued, looked less like coincidence and more like escape. Most of all, prosecutors leaned on the science. They told the jury Jessica fought back, clawing at her attacker, leaving his DNA under her nails. They stressed that this was not accidental contact. This was the mark of resistance. Witnesses reinforced the prosecution's case. A lead genealogist explained the process in detail, answering every challenge the defense would later raise about reliability. A forensic scientist testified that the DNA from the soda can discarded by Dillard in 2019 matched the DNA under Jessica's fingernails with absolute certainty. An investigator described the surveillance that led to the collection of that soda can, showing the careful chain of custody that kept the evidence clean. There were also community voices. One resident recalled Dillard joining search parties in 1992, describing how he had stood beside Jessica's family while pretending to help find her. That moment left a strong impression in court, suggesting not just guilt, but deliberate deception. The defense countered with their own arguments. They didn't deny that DNA had been found, but they tried to weaken its weight. They claimed it could have been the result of secondary transfer, DNA carried through indirect contact. They pointed out that there were no eyewitnesses who saw Dillard with Jessica that night. No confession, no murder weapon, no other physical evidence tying him to the crime. They asked the jury to consider reasonable doubt. If science could identify relatives through distant matches, could it also make mistakes? If Dillard's DNA was on Jessica, was it possible it had been transferred another way, through casual contact or contamination? But prosecutors responded with force. They reminded the defense urged caution, warning against conviction without direct eyewitness testimony. They argued that the state's case was built on probabilities and inferences. But after 3 decades, the jury was not persuaded by doubt alone. The jury deliberated for 3 full days. Behind closed doors, they discussed every angle. Could DNA alone be enough? Could they convict without a confession, without a weapon, without an eyewitness? The weight of the decision was heavy, but in the end, the DNA spoke louder than any doubt. In February 2022, the jury returned to the courtroom. Franklin Dillard was found guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole. The verdict sent shockwaves through the room. Members of the Monroe family wept openly, holding one another as the reality of justice finally set in. After 30 years, they had heard the words they had been waiting for. Guilty. In the gallery, some members of the community applauded, a rare outburst in a courtroom, quickly hushed by the judge but impossible to contain. Reporters rushed to file their stories. Outside, cameras captured tears, relief, and a sense of closure spreading through the crowd. Linda Monroe addressed the press with steady resolve. "Justice has finally been served," she said. "We have waited too long, but today we can say the truth has been spoken." For the people of Macon, the verdict closed a chapter of fear and uncertainty that had hung over their town for decades. The red pickup truck was no longer a symbol of rumor and suspicion. It was evidence, and it had led to a conviction. National media picked up the story once more. Commentators called it a landmark case, proof that science could bring justice even after decades of silence. Experts praised the use of genealogy, saying it marked a turning point for cold case investigations in the South. The immediate impact was clear. Prosecutors across Georgia cited the case as precedent for the use of genealogical databases,
Lawmakers pointed to it as justification for expanding funding to cold case units. Families of other victims reached out to the Monroes. When the verdict was delivered in February 2022, the Monroe family finally had what they had fought for over 3 decades: justice. But the story did not end inside that courtroom. What followed was a wave of change within the family, within Georgia, and far beyond. The Monroes decided almost immediately that Jessica's name would not only be tied to tragedy. They created the Jessica Monroe Foundation, a scholarship fund dedicated to young women pursuing science. It was a reflection of Jessica's dream, cut short in 1992. Each year since, Macon has hosted fundraising events, community dinners, charity runs, and school programs. Students, teachers, and neighbors come together, raising money while sharing stories of Jessica's determination. The scholarship has already supported dozens of students, turning personal loss into opportunity for a new generation. At the state level, the impact was impossible to ignore. Georgia lawmakers cited Jessica's case during hearings on unsolved homicides and forensic funding. Her name was read into the official record as proof that cold cases could be solved, even decades later, if evidence was preserved. By the end of 2022, the legislature expanded funding for specialized cold case units. They passed new policies requiring the indefinite preservation of biological evidence, ensuring that no other family would suffer because samples had been destroyed too soon. Other southern states followed, adopting similar laws. What happened in Macon reshaped investigative standards across the region. Within law enforcement, the Monroe case became a cornerstone example of persistence meeting science. At the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, new recruits studied it as part of their training. At FBI seminars, detectives walked through the timeline, 1992 to 2022, as a model of how patience and forensic breakthroughs could close even the darkest chapters. It was no longer just a file or a story. It was a teaching tool, one that reminded investigators to never dismiss the value of preserved evidence. Across the country, police departments began reopening long-dormant files, hopeful that the next breakthrough might be just one DNA profile away. Linda Monroe became the voice of that transformation. Speaking after the sentencing, she said, "It took 30 years, but Jessica's story proves truth always finds its way." Her words were carried by national networks, quoted in newspapers across the United States. For Linda, it was not just about closure. It was about making sure Jessica was remembered not only as a victim, but as a symbol of perseverance and progress. She wanted her daughter's name to inspire action, to encourage families of other missing persons to never give up. The reaction went far beyond Georgia. National outlets framed the case as one of the strongest examples of how genetic genealogy could change criminal investigations. The Washington Post, CNN, and countless podcasts told Jessica's story as a landmark moment for forensic science. True crime documentaries revisited the case, explaining how strands of DNA under her fingernails eventually unraveled a mystery that had haunted Macon for decades. Commentators called it a victory of science and patience. The message spread. Families in despair could hold on to hope because technology might still deliver answers. While the Monroes finally had a measure of peace, Franklin Dillard's fate closed the final chapter of the investigation. He now serves life in prison without parole, confined after living freely for almost 30 years. For the community, that knowledge brought relief but also anger. Many recalled how Dillard had walked among them, pretending to search for Jessica in 1992, when he was the one who had taken her life. That betrayal lingers,
but knowing he will never leave prison has allowed Macon to step out from under the shadow of fear. Today, Jessica's story is carried in multiple ways. Through scholarships, her name appears in university bulletins and graduation ceremonies. Through law enforcement, her case is taught to young detectives learning how to handle evidence. Through her community, she is remembered at every vigil and every August gathering. Her memory did not fade into silence. Instead, it became part of something larger: policy change, investigative reform, and cultural memory. The broader meaning is clear. Even mysteries buried for decades can be solved if evidence is preserved and science continues to advance. Jessica Monroe's legacy proves that time does not.
Her legacy is not defined by the night she disappeared, but by everything that followed: the fight, the discovery, the trial, and the reforms. She lives on in the scholarship that bears her name, in the bench by the river, in the training manuals of investigators, and in the memory of a community that never stopped searching. Justice came late, but it came. And in the end, Jessica Monroe's story shows that justice, even delayed, still has the power to heal and to inspire.